Great. Hey, how's everyone doing? Good. All right. Semi-lively. Bruce is always lively. So I'm here to talk about whether alternative proteins and cellular agriculture are a part of national security. Uh, I have a very different background than maybe everyone in this room. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a food expert. I'm a national security professional, so I spent the first half of my career working as an intelligence officer and as a civilian advisor to the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Now, in the second half of my career, I work at a think tank that focuses on global affairs. It's called the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and I run our tech policy program. And we focus on a lot of classic national security issues, AI, disinformation, cybersecurity. And there's a little piece there that I've carved out for alternative proteins and cellular ag. So maybe just let's do a quick show of hands here. How many people would say that if I would just say there's a linkage here, that cellular ag has half a dozen different national security implications and applications? Raise your hand if that feels kind of obvious and intuitive to you and something that you've thought about a fair amount. Okay, all right, half the room. Okay, and so everyone else, that's a no. So I'll try to be a little bit responsive to both of those categories today. So for the people who did not raise your hand, why even pose this question? Why even make this linkage between cell ag and national security? I think the first point I would want to make is that national security is a very open-ended and malleable concept. I first started thinking about this under the Biden administration. Joe Biden put out a document called the National Security Strategy for the United States. Every president does this. Trump just put out his national security strategy. And if you were to analyze that document, you would find many thematic comparisons to things that we've been talking about already today. Climate change was framed as a national security issue. Pandemics, obviously, framed as a national security issue. Food security globally and lifting up the developing world. These were all framed as national security issues. And of course, technology competition with China, things that are more familiar. So there's a lot of consonance there in terms of certain ways of thinking about national security can actually wrap up things that might otherwise just be seen as like nice things to do for the world. I think the second major point is that this kind of linkage can offer strategic benefits for this sector. And I'll just be blunt here. The national security apparatus is the most powerful and well-funded part of the US government. I mentioned some of my work on disinformation, and there are a lot of researchers at different universities and think tanks scrounging for funding to study this topic. And then at some point under the Biden administration, word went out that the Defense Department had just signed like a multi-billion-dollar contract to fund defense-related disinformation researchers. It's kind of stunning number, but everything that the Defense Department does is at that range. I mean, we used to use the term budget dust to refer to million-dollar ranges in the Pentagon, right? So there's benefits for the alternative protein sector, and there's a credible linkage. My institution, Carnegie, we're not in the business of lobbying or kind of making links that don't make sense, so I'm trying to figure out where those linkages do and don't make sense. And I would say there's been potential receptivity. When I talk to members of Congress, senior members of the defense establishment, on both sides of the aisle, there's a level of receptivity there. So let's dive into this a little bit more deeply. I think we're at a moment where there's a ripeness to have some of this conversation in ways that we haven't before, for several different reasons. One is the return of so-called industrial policy. Now, people may know industrial policy refers to the US government doing more than just setting the broad conditions for the business community through things like fiscal policy and tax rates, but actually picking strategic industries that are seen as essential for national well-being and national security and providing targeted support to those. And we have seen this idea, which was a taboo in the late 20th century in kind of the neoliberal era, come raging back with things like the Chips and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, many things that the US government is doing now, spending billions of dollars trying to encourage and promote anything that's defined as a national security and strategic industry. So can cell ag position itself as part of that conversation? The other thing is just the securitization of everything. Generally speaking, the people in Washington right now who are running our international economic policy are national security people, right? So what are the most important economic policies of the Trump administration? Obviously, there was the big beautiful bill with tax cuts and the like. That's important. But tariffs really are the economic story of this administration, and that is being run out of the Commerce Department by a bunch of foreign policy people. And then finally, there is increasing interest among national security community people in Washington on biotechnology. People may know that there was something that just finished up its work called the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology. The creation of this congressionally chartered commission was a bit of a signal that biotech was starting to reach a level of mind share amongst the national security state beyond what it had had before. Now, I still think most people involved in national security in DC couldn't really tell you what they mean by biotech, right? If you were to ask people in the Pentagon about other forms of strategic technology, they could quickly rattle off technologies that they understand broadly. Everyone understands, whether you're a technologist or not. Hypersonic missiles, general artificial intelligence, 5G, advanced semiconductors. You can kind of rattle off the list of kind of broadly understood strategic technologies. And then someone will say, oh yeah, and biotech. But if you ask them what's inside that biotech bucket, they really can't answer that question. A few years from now, they will be able to answer that question. So the policymaking community has gotten a broad comfort with digital technology. It's now moving into the biotech space. This is an opportunity to define for the national security community what is in that bucket. And I would argue we should want CellAg to be in that bucket. Now, it's a double-edged sword, right? I've talked about how when you're in that bucket, you can get billions of dollars of government support. You can also get a measure of legitimation and political protection. So actually, we all know there's people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and other politicians who have attacked cellular agriculture as some kind of disturbing, un-American, unmasculine frankenfood. That same political movement also has been behind a populist backlash against artificial intelligence. But the best friends that the AI industry has in Washington are the national security community, who sees it as a strategic necessity for America to lead in AI. So that's the kind of benefit that you could get in terms of legitimation as well. But I just want to say that there's risks and harms also. When you're in this national security bucket, people start controlling you. We've seen this with semiconductors. There are massive export controls that now control the movement of semiconductors and related equipment and data and know-how around the world. This affects everything from visa policy, academic collaboration, right? So if people like me are successful in framing this as a national security industry, it could also mean that it's difficult to collaborate with a Chinese scientist, right? It could also mean that there's more scrutiny of where this technology is sold to and where things are built and how they're secured. Some challenges when I try to make these linkages. These are things that come up in conversations that I have with other national security professionals. The number one challenge, low salience. People don't know what alternative proteins or cellular agriculture is, right? The Beyond Burgers of the world, that's helped to a degree. That creates like a familiar touch point for people. That can be a positive or a negative touch point, depending on who you're talking to. But when you start getting into lab-grown meat and certainly some of the fermented stuff, which is just very much not on the radar, it's off the wall, it's unfamiliar, right? So I think part of the project is just putting it on the wall, putting it on the radar. Second major challenge is unfocused narrative. And David Kaplan talked about this earlier. How do we message? I personally feel like there's 10 different arguments that I want to make to people when I get in the room. I've learned that that's not an effective approach. And so what are the best arguments? I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. The tumult in the industry is a challenge, right? So ultimately, this industry will rise or fall based on consumer adoption globally. We're at a moment where the media and business narrative is negative. So that then is something that policymakers are aware of, right? Oh, haven't consumers already rejected this? So you need to kind of have that conversation. And then the changing meanings of national security. As the Democrats have been pushed out of Washington and the Republicans have swept in, that has radically shifted the meaning and the prioritization of national security issues, and that has implications for this messaging. I just want to say, of the 4 challenges on this screen, 2 of them are directly controllable by people in this room and other advocates, in the United States and around the world. And by the way, I'm mentioning the United States a lot. I mentioned to say earlier, one of the aspects of the double-edged sword of framing something as a national security issue is how do other countries, even beyond China, respond to this? We heard from Bruce earlier about South Korea and Germany and Denmark and India and so many other countries excited to invest in this. The US is doing good, but I would argue it's a laggard in terms of federal investment. But if we awaken the sleeping giant of the US national security state to help out with some of these investments, what kind of reactions and reverberations would we get in these allied states? That's an important question as well. So let's talk about the meaning of national security, how that's shifting, and the implications for cell ag and alternative proteins. I think most people have a sense that national security is a broadly bipartisan issue. I think that's roughly true. I'll give you an example. There's a bill that Congress passes every year called the National Defense Authorization Act. This is the main defense policy bill. This is one of the most bipartisan bills in Congress. So that kind of gives you an illustration that there still is a core of national security that's very bipartisan. But I would argue that this picture here is becoming less and less the case. And the parties are moving farther and farther apart in their definitions of what America's vital national security interests are and the means by which they want to pursue them. So I mentioned earlier Biden's national security strategy. Trump now has a formal published national security strategy. There's a radical difference between the two documents. And so I think actually, although there's a lot in common, you will hear Democrats talk about things like global health and global institutions, democracy, foreign aid, climate as national security issues. That just does not resonate with the modern day Republican Party. They're much more interested in breaking and remaking world systems, doing things unilaterally and bilaterally, utilizing hard power. So it's just a different case that you have to make to that crowd. And I think when we think about long-term strategic messaging, there's a choice to be made about whether we try to target that increasingly slim area of commonly agreed upon national security priorities and try to put alternative proteins and cell ag in that bucket, or if you have a different message for each party or try to consolidate a certain kind of political base in Congress. Open question. So what are the narratives that I find work when I talk to people? I'll give you a few. One is military use cases. So DARPA is investing in some of this right now. There's a tactical piece of this, which is US troops in the field in far-flung, austere environments need to eat, and it is difficult to get them that food. Hundreds of contractors were killed in Afghanistan in just a several-year period. This has been documented, getting food to forward operating bases. People on aircraft carriers need to get food delivered to them, either at a port call or through some kind of submarine transit, right? So this is logistically difficult, this is risky, this is very expensive. If we can shorten or cut the supply chains, create food in situ, on site, right, that would be a remarkable benefit. So an open question for people working on this is, can we make a credible case that that supply chain and cost efficacy works? The other military connection here as far as food security is US allies. So food security can mean a lot of different things. I tend to think of the United States as a relatively food secure country. We are largely food self-sufficient. We do import food, but it's not a necessity that we do so. It's mostly things that we want to import. And we export a lot of things that we also import. So there's a kind of back and forth flow. We're a major food superpower. But what about our allies? If there's ever a war with China, it will be fought over the fate of Taiwan. When that war starts, maritime shipping in the Western Pacific will be shut down. Deliveries will not be made to and from countries like Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines. These are countries whose cooperation the United States will need for basing, access, and overflight to carry out a military campaign. It then becomes critical that the populations in those countries like the progress of the war and feel that they are not suffering due to staple foods becoming more expensive and less available. So it becomes a political problem. When I mentioned three countries, Taiwan, Japan, I mentioned the Philippines to a lesser extent, these are not food self-sufficient countries. They import a lot of food. So can we build up industries in those countries? And again, open question of what exactly does that supply chain look like? Beating China, that always works in DC. All you really need to do to start any conversation in DC is, well, China's working on this. And it's true, China's investing a lot in this. Now, I think that in general, the US and Chinese economies and technology ecosystems are decoupling. So I think it's rather unlikely that if any high-tech cellular agriculture is commercialized in the future, we will be selling it to China or China will be selling it to us. I think probably there will be some kind of technology wall that's set up. But there will be a game, a great game to sell to the rest of the world. And that's the pitch that you want to make in DC. And I think another narrative that I find works with people is thinking about the role that cellular ag and food tech can play in the broader bioeconomy. There are people thinking about much bigger visions for where this could all head. That we in the future could have cellular foundries all throughout the United States, manufacturing everything from jet fuel to, asphalt to whatever, right? If we can somehow make a credible case that food could be the industrial and commercial foundation to create a kind of flywheel of money and talent to help lift off this vision, I think that would be a very powerful case to make to people in Washington. Some unanswered questions that I have. Notice my terminology keeps shifting. Are we talking about alternative proteins, plant-based, cellular ag, fermentation? I honestly never quite know where I should be focusing when I'm talking to different people, so this is a major question that I have. So much of what I've talked about is dependent on the particular supply chains that will develop around these industries as they're commercialized. What are the inputs? Where do they come from? How do they move throughout the world? I had a member of Congress ask me, so where are these jobs going to be? I couldn't necessarily answer that question. I think that's an important thing to figure out here. And then when you get somebody in a room and they say, I get it, this is a national security issue, what then do we ask for? What's the ask? I don't often have good answers to that either. So I would just say for myself, before I go to questions, my own tentative goals are to build the analytic base to make these cases more credibly and with better information, to basically increase the salience of these issues and the mind share amongst the group of policymakers, leaders, and thinkers who are part of this national security community, and to better identify the asks that we would make when we get there. So that's my talk. I'm gonna look at questions now, which I've not looked at. Okay, so I'm just gonna go through these. The current administration has reduced the number of subject matter experts in the Capitol, which is also why DoD personnel can't accurately describe what biotech is. Do you think an influx of younger biotech specialized experts in Capitol can help influence the government's interest in cellular ag and wider biotech? Short answer is yes. There have been a number of very successful efforts in other tech areas and in tech broadly to infuse the policymaking apparatus in DC with technologists. So there's the AAAS Fellowship, there's Tech Congress, we have the Horizon Fellowship, which now has a alternative proteins track. So there are people that are trying to embed themselves in these agencies and in Capitol Hill as we speak to start these conversations. I'll just say broadly, Congress in particular is really suffering from a lack of technical expertise. There's more in the executive branch. But in many ways, the Trump administration is an experiment in can you run the government without experts, right? And I say that in all seriousness, and I actually don't think the answer is necessarily no. In the foreign policy realm, we live in an era of presidential foreign policy. And so to a great degree, President Trump can personally get on phone calls with foreign leaders and let his instincts guide him. Now, that gets harder the more technical the issue is. But I do think this community needs to think about political alliances and people who are kind of schmoozers and relationship people as much as the technical knowledge. So I'll just give you an example of this. I mentioned AI policy. People may know the term the tech right. Does this term resonate with people, right? So people like David Sachs, Elon Musk, a group of people who largely are involved in the AI and crypto sectors who were politically important in President Trump's reelection and now have an influential voice in the Washington, D.C. area. Who is the David Sachs of biotech? I would love to know the answer to that question. I would love to know who in the tech right can be a voice for the types of issues that this community is interested in, so that when there's cuts to the National Science Foundation and the NIH, that there's an understanding that food tech is actually an area that needs to be preserved or even grown. So we need to be able to answer that question. Maybe it's Vivek Ramaswamy, I don't know. Is there consideration for cell ag filling some gaps left by US aid? Namely, stabilizing regions, keep them from escalating to hostile engagement, yada, yada, yada. Yes. This is how I think about the argument. We all know cellular agriculture is very expensive. Plant-based meat also generally is more expensive than the regular meat. And people in the poorest and most war-torn parts of the world aren't eating a lot of meat anyway compared to people in this room. So I don't view aid-receiving countries as being the initial consumers of these products. But what people in these countries do eat is staple foods, rice, grains, and the like, soy. These are global commodities. The prices are set to some extent as global commodity prices. Consumers in these difficult countries are competing against livestock in rich countries for the pricing of those food products. If we can shift away from consuming livestock in wealthy countries, that could take some price pressure off of poor countries. Now, this is a case that I made in the Biden era where there was a very clear understanding that food aid is a way of preventing countries from becoming so unstable that we don't need to intervene militarily later. And in very difficult countries like Afghanistan, Yemen, and the like, food has been in the center, Haiti, of instability there. I just think that argument doesn't resonate in this administration, to be perfectly honest, but it might resonate in Congress. How much time do I have, Mira? Should I wrap up? One more question. Okay. If you take coffee from Americans, there will be Civil War II. Is there an argument for greater investment in plant cell agriculture for greater independence from climate-vulnerable crops? Yeah, so I'm just going to bridge this back to the discussion I had about China war contingency and wartime access to food. So I think that there wouldn't literally be a Civil War II, right? And so I don't think I can define Americans' access to coffee precisely as a national security issue. You want to maintain your credibility. But leaders in every country know how emotional and culturally sensitive the price and availability of food is. And so when an emergency, let's say COVID, makes something like meatpacking plants shut down, this actually is understood as kind of a national emergency because leaders quickly become aware that people will be agitating and protesting, and the very legitimacy and popularity of the central government and their whole approach to a national emergency could be on the line if access to staple and familiar foods is not available. So I think that's the national security case, that we want to make sure that populations are comfortable with the course of events as an emergency or national security crisis or war unfolds. Alternative proteins could become part of that story. If this has sparked any interest, I'd love to talk to anybody who has an idea or question on this topic, and I'll hand it back to Mira.